So in our today's session, basically we are going to look at how you can separate sort of callbacks from routes. The last session we looked at how you can create a dedicated folder for routes. You have routes accountants. Well, we created the routes for accountants, students, teachers, and how we mapped these routes within the index file, as you can see. So we have stroke teachers, then TR routes or teachers routes, and it literally goes to route stroke teachers, which is basically a file that has the routes for teachers. If you have route stroke students, which is the routes file for students, then you have that file, and with in a constant students routes, and you can see you're mapping stroke students to students routes. The same is what we apply to accountants routes. So today, when you go to these routes, you realize that we have callback. Remember we said that when you look at this get, for example, it has the path first, and then the next we said where you have this function. A function is which is a callback, a function executed within another function. So you have this callback where it's function, request, and then response. Then this callback is written within the routes, but for purposes of having clean code, you make sure that you separate these callbacks from routes. So instead of having this function here, you create a dedicated folder, and most times we call it controllers. You create that folder controllers, and that's why you write your callbacks, these functions that are written within these routes. So instead of putting like this function here, you create a dedicated folder or a file within a folder called controllers, and then you write these callbacks. So so that's for purposes of writing clean code, and making sure that if you're going to make changes in your code, you know where you're going to refactor from. You know that if, for example, you're going to change where data is coming from, that data is being sent by the controller, then you go and literally go and change that controller specifically. So that's basically it. So we are going to reorganize our routes. Instead of having these callbacks here, basically the body of callbacks, what we have inside here, this one, this data, we will purposely write controllers that will manage these requests or processing these requests. So one, we are saying that we are sort of you're trying to make sure that you have clean code. That's the first thing. Two is you don't want to clutter your routes with a lot of code. So just like we had started in index file, where we had everything in that one file, but as we've kept on going, we've seen that we introduced in the routes folder and the constants folder. Initially, when we had not introduced that, we had almost, this file had we are on 127th line of code, but you can see now we are on 25th line of code, and we've reduced the number of lines of code in our index file, because we've created dedicated folders for handling specific things. So it's the same thing that we are going to look at today, basically controllers. And just like I've said, first of all, we write there like functions. Sometimes in controllers they might have classes, and classes might possess methods, which are basically like the contents of these contents of these callbacks. So so we can start by creating a folder that for controllers. So you mk directory or make a directory controllers. So when you make that directory, it comes here. You can see we have this controllers, and so now I don't know if you've ever heard of the architecture pattern called MVC, which is model views controllers. Model views controllers. Now with that architecture pattern, you have your application divided into those three parts: models, which literally handle the data part, yeah, everything that is associated with data, maybe databases, migrations, all that. Those are models. Then views are just with the application layout, the application layout, like you can call it the markup, the markup, the HTML, if it is, for example, you're doing HTML. So it's basically the application layout. How is the application designed? Those are views. And then when you go to controllers, they deal with, the data logic, the business logic. Okay, you can call it the business logic. The business logic, literally how things are handled. If let's say it's about getting like teachers who have maybe given criteria, that logic, where that logic is written, it is literally in what we call controllers. So the model view controller, the controllers, they handle the business logic, or you can say they handle the incoming requests, or you can say they process data and then return appropriate responses. When a request is received from a route, it is sent to the controller, and then the controller processes that data and then sends back a response. So that's basically what we are. For example, when you look at this is the logic. Like when you receive a request stroke teachers, this is now stroke accountants, it gets this data from our constants folder, our data file, and then sends back the response. Literally, this should be in controllers, because controllers are the ones that handle incoming requests and then process the data and then send back the appropriate response. So this is the appropriate response for where we have response.send. Remember, REST is the abbreviation for response. So response.send, it is sending back data of accountants and then the parameters that come with that request. So that's basically the controllers. And the controllers, the sort of like intermediaries that exist between the user interface and the data. Remember, we are saying when you look at MVC, the controllers are like in between, yeah, because you have the views where the requests, or the views are like the user interfaces where the requests are sent from, and then when they are sent from the views, then the controllers, they handle those requests through by getting requests through the routes or the endpoints, and then these controllers will get data from models, and they respond back with the appropriate responses or data. So that's basically controllers. So in this case, we can create the first controller. We can call it maybe teachers controller.js. And when you look at so we've created this file, teachers controller.js, and we are saying that that's why you write your business logic, or that's where data is processed. For example, you have, when you send in a request for getting teachers, remember here we only have stroke because we've already mapped stroke teachers to go to TR routes, which is this teachers file. So now when you get a request for stroke teachers, instead of writing this logic of saying data.teachers, which processes or which gets the list of teachers, what you do, you write this function, or you write a function for getting teachers, because literally what you're doing here is getting the data of teachers, getting a list of teachers from the data file. So what you do, you can write, you say maybe constant, maybe teachers controllers, or teachers controller, and inside, so you write sort of like a constant, and then inside you can write functions. And so you can say get teachers as the first method, and this first function for getting teachers will help us get will help us process data, and this data that is going to be processed is basically returning a list of teachers. So we saw that we are getting a list of teachers from the file called data. We have teachers here, so we have our data, which is a module, and so we can import it within the this teachers controller. So we come here, we say constant data equals require, and then we have stock constants, stock data, and so here we have access to data. And so remember, this data module has JSON of accountants, teachers, and students. So which means that if I'm going to get a list of teachers here, I can come here and say constant teachers equals data dot teachers. As you can see, I told you that when you have like this box appearing, it means that that data is accessible. That's why you have this box, this kind of shape. It's sort of like a box. Yeah. If you look at data, there's ABC, means that it's not known. But when you look at teachers, students, accountants, means they're accessible and that data exists. So which means at this point we have a list of teachers. Yeah. So all we can say, we say return teachers. And so here, this function, which is, get teachers, which is within the teachers controller, is able to help us to return the list of what? Teachers. Essentially, we said that instead of getting this hard-coded data from this file data, we shall be getting from this data from database, and that's what we shall be looking at in the next session. This list of teachers should be coming from a database, but for now we are still using the hard-coded data. So now you can write as many functions as you can within this teachers controller, but let's start with teachers controller, and we can of course now export our module. So we can say module dot exports, and then we export our teachers controller, this one, so that we can have access to all the methods that will be within this teachers controller. So this is how you can write, one of the ways you can write controllers. Then we will look at in the subsequent run, where in the sessions when we've looked at a couple of things, we will see how you can use maybe classes. For now we are just using functions. You write like a constant, inside you put your functions, but we shall see how can we use, for example, use what we call classes. Yeah. So but we'll keep upgrading our skills gradually. So for now we are writing a constant, and that constant, this module teachers controller, has got functions. For example, the first function, our function that we've written, is get teachers. We will write more functions. For now, to access, now instead of, you realize that now the logic for getting data stock teachers, which is data dot teachers, has been written in the teachers controller. So in this case here, where we have data dot teachers, we shall use our controllers. So now we can come here and say we import the module called teachers controller. So we can say a constant teachers controller, and then we say equals require, then stroke controller stroke teachers controller, as you can see it. And then when we come here, this data of getting data dot teachers, now we're accessing it through teachers controller, then dot, as you can see, I told you that when something is accessible, you will see a box here. So you see this box, which means get teachers, which means it's a method. You can see it exists, it's a method here. So it's, you put get teachers, and so even when you put this, you can see that you can go back to it. When you hover or when you click on it, it takes you to where this method exists. When you come back here, and then you press the button control on your keyboard, and then when you press control and then you hover over it, you see it underlines it, which means it exists. And then when you click that, it takes you to that method, which means it exists very well and you're able to access it. So literally, this controller is helping us to process the data. That's why I've told you that controllers, they process requests and return appropriate responses. So when we receive a request for getting teachers, this request is sent to a controller for teachers controller, and then it is sent to a method called get teachers. And so this get teachers method will return a list of teachers, and then say when you get teachers, then you send back the response of teachers, and then you send back the data. So that's the first one. If we come back to our endpoints here where we had stroke teachers, and then I think we've not yet started the API, so npm run local. So when it starts, and now when we run it again, realize that we are able to get our teachers, yeah, list of our teachers. To detect that we are going through our controller, we can come here and say console.log teachers. We can say teachers are being processed or returned through a controller. To confirm that the request is being processed by this controller, I'm just doing a console.log, so that in case we send a request and we see this response being logged on our terminal, then we will know that this data being returned is going through this method, which is this. So the moment we send in this request and we see this statement being logged, then it means that this method in our controller is the one that is processing the request. Now if we send this response, and then we go to our terminal, you can see we have this message that teachers are being returned through a controller, which means that this method is the one that is handling this request of returning teachers. So that's basically it. So we can remove it. So which means that it is our controller which is processing the request. So we can also go and write more methods for these other endpoints or path. For example, this is for posting teachers. So instead of writing all this data here, which is processing our request, we can remove this, and then we write a controller, that a method in our controller, teachers controller, that will handle this request of posting teacher. So here we can, when you're posting, we said when you're posting, it is like creating a resource. So we can say create teacher. But this create teacher, we expect, of course, you have to put a comma here. Put a comma after get teachers, and then this, when we are posting, we say we are creating a resources in the database. So we are posting to create a teacher. So we need a request. We need this request object, so that we can get the parameters that are being sent from the endpoint, because a post comes with parameters, the teacher's ID or name, first name or whatever. So we need that data. So to get that data, we have to use the request object, so which is passed from here, because in this case you can see we have request to response. So we need this request object so that we can get the parameters. And of course, I post this data to get the body. We looked at how do we get the body. You said request.body, and then you have what we call the payload. The payload is basically the data that comes along with the request. So in this case, then last time we were we were sending back this, but instead of doing a response.send, what we can say maybe returned. We say we put data, and then we put maybe payload. Yeah. So in this case, we are responding back, because remember, controllers have to respond back. They return responses. That's why here we had get teachers was returning teachers. If you're creating teacher, and then a controller must respond, must return appropriate responses. So in this case, I'm returning data, which is basically the payload, the request parameters that come along with the request. Talk of the first name, the age of the teacher. So in this case, we've created the endpoint, sorry, the method within the teacher's controller, and this method is for creating teacher. This was for getting, this one is for creating a teacher, and it is taking in a parameter, which is basically the request object that comes with the request, and then we are getting parameters. We said if it is a post, you get the data request.body, and then you can access the individual parameters through payload.the parameter that you've written in there. We looked at all of this when we are starting. So here, in this case, remember we had the logic here. But now this logic is no longer handled here, but is now being handled by a method in the teacher's controller. So we can say constant data equals teacher's controller, then dot. As you can see, now we have create teacher. You can see I told you that when a method exists, we will see a box. When it does not exist, it means that it does not exist. So you can see when I say dot, we have our create teacher method, and you can see here even the parameter, you have the request object here, request, which is this one, because that create teacher takes in a parameter called what? Request. So we say create teacher, and when you do like this, it is showing you that takes in a parameter request. You can see it here. So this request is this, or this request object. So we can pass our request object. So now, of course, when you say, then you have to send back. You have to use the response object if you're to send back. So response.send, then you send back the data, which will be sent by this method. And if the method exists, when you press Control and you hover it, you will see the method being underlined. And when you click that method, it will take you to the where exactly the method is written in your controller. So we've also written our method for creating teacher, and we've created that method in our controller called the teacher's controller, as you can see here. So if we come to create teacher and we write, and you basically, in this case we are using, I think, raw JSON, but remember we said you can also use URL form encoded. I don't know if we had written any data here. Looks like we no longer have that data, but we can put it. We can put ID, maybe 505, 5005. We put maybe name. We say maybe Derek. We put age, maybe 21. We put qualification, maybe masters in computer science. So if we post this request, here's that we get response, yeah, of basically what we've put. ID, which is 5005, name, we have Derek, we have age 21, we have qualification masters in computer science. Of course, we looked at how you can do this, yeah, in our first session when creating endpoints, and of course you can still see how we've done that. And of course, the reason as to why we have date of birth undefined is because we did not put date of birth as a parameter. But when we put date of birth as another parameter here, then we say maybe 2000 February, maybe 22nd or 23rd, and then we post the request. Then we should be able to have date of birth also added to the request, as you can see it here. Then when you check the console, you can now see that we have date of birth being logged. So that's basically it. So literally, what you would do is you would have to send like this data, these details of a student, because you're trying to create a teacher, you're trying to record their details in the database. So at this point, you would have to record their name, age, qualification, and DOB in a database, so that you have those teachers' details created in a database. So instead of, now I want to teach you something new, and we call it destructuring. Yeah, instead of saying period.name, period.age, period.qualification, period.dob, you can access these parameters through a method and through an approach we call destructuring. So destructuring, you get the individual, you write constant, and then you put the curly brackets, and then you access the individual parameters that are on a given object. In this, our object is period, so it has the keys name, age, qualification, and DOB. So instead of saying period.name, we can destructure. We say constant, we put our brackets, and then we say name, and then we say age, and then we say the keys which are in that object, which is period. Qualification, I said DOB, and then you say equals, then you put period. So in this case, you don't now need to use period.name, but you say name, you say age, then you say qualification, then you say DOB. So at this point you have, instead of using period dot name period dot age, you do what we call destructure. Destructuring is like accessing the values of the keys, like of name. A name is a key with a value. Age, you access the values of these keys by destructuring, and by destructuring this object, which is period. So in this case, if we run this back, you on the console you still see that we have these values: name Derek, age 21, qualification masters in computer science, and date of birth as 2000 and that month. So that's what we call destructuring. Yeah, you can access the keys instead of saying period dot name period dot age. You destructure in this by this approach, and that's what we call destructuring. So we've also created to show you that of course we can maintain that, so that here we can say teachers. I want to show you that we are processing our request for creating teachers. I've changed this from data to teachers, so that if we run this, we shall have this key changing from data to teachers to confirm that our request is actually being handled by this method in our controller. So if we run it back, guys, now we have teachers here, which means that this request for posting teachers is being handled by this create teacher method in our controller. So yeah, so you can see now this data, we are not using this data, and that's why it is not highlighted. This data, as you can see, it sort of goes gray. It is like gray, which means that it's not being used. So you can remove it since we are not using it. Yeah, so that's basically it. So now I've created teachers controller, and that teachers controller, we've written our methods get teachers and post and create teacher. Yeah, it's not a must that you must name it create teacher. You can name it anything, but remember method name should be reasonable, so that when other developer reads the method name, they are able to understand what that method does. So if you say create teacher, it really echoes in your mind that, oh, this is a method for creating a teacher. If it is get teacher, oh, this is the get teachers, it means, oh, this is the method for getting what? A list of teachers. So lastly, I'm going to repeat what I've done by creating a controller for students. Maybe in your practice you can create one for accountants. So I come here, I create a new file. I say students controller.js. So here you say constant. It's not a must that you must name it in the constant. You can use the let, but I told you the difference between let and constant. So you can say let students controller, and then you say equals, then you open brackets. Then the first method we can say get students, or you can say get a list of students. Whatever, you can name it anything, but remember a method name should be reasonable, or should reflect what the method is doing. So for example, I want to return the list of students. When you go to our endpoint for the one for students here, and you look at the endpoint that was used to get students, you realize that we are getting these students from data students. Yeah, data.students, because that's where we have our decoded data of students. So we will come back to this, and we first import our data, which is the hard-coded data. We say require, and then we say constant stock data, and so here we shall say constant students equals data dot students. As I told you that whenever data exists, or whenever it exists, you can see you have those box accountants, students, teachers, which means that data is accessible. So we need stock students. Then we say return students. Then we need to export this students controller, this module. So we say module.exports, then we say students controller. Yeah, so we've created our controller. In that controller, we've created a method get students, which will return the list of students, and we are getting these students from the hard coded data in our, which we had coded previously in our data, in our file called data, where we have data of accountants, students, and then teachers. So now we are going to access this controller in the students routes file. So here we can come here and say constant students controller, and then you say require, then you say stroke controllers stroke. You can see we have now students controller there. We have student and then teachers, so we need students controller. Now we shall access this data. Instead of getting these students, we say, because now we are getting that data, previously we were getting it from the data.students, but now this data is being returned from the controller by a method called get students. So it is students controller, then dot. The moment you say dot, where you see this box means that the method exists. So you can see we have get students, this method of ours, so which means that it is being accessed from this file. So you put get students, and then when you hover over it, I told you when you press Control on the keyboard and then you hover over it, if the method exists, you will see it and being underlined. And when you click it, it will take you to the where that method exists. So and now the request, now you can see that when we get a request stroke teachers, it is being handled by a method called get students that exists in the students controller, yeah, which is here. So just a moment. So we can proceed. So I was saying that now we have the request stroke students being handled by get students. So even for the method for creating the student, which is stroke create, let's first run the one for getting students. We see if it is running through get students. So here we can do we can say console.log. You can say request is being handled by the controller or by students controller, yeah, by the students controller. So now if we run and we see this message being logged, then it means that the request is being handled by this method called get students that exists in the students controller. So we shall come here and we run our endpoint for get students, which is here. So if we run this, we have Dalton, Delk, and when you come, if you check our terminal, you realize that we have a message request is being handled by the students controller, yeah. So which means that our message our request is being handled by can you guys hear me?
Yes, sir, we are hearing you.
Okay, good. So that means our request is being handled by the what? By the controller, because we can see the message. You can see the message being logged on the console. So we can go ahead and create, we can go ahead and create, when you come to stroke, when you go our file for getting students, realize that we have for create. So instead of doing this here, this data being processed here, we're going to write a method for creating student in our controller. So here we put a comma and say create student, and then it must take in request because we need to get the parameters that are being sent. So here we can say const maybe data, and then we say request.body, yeah, and maybe we can log this data, say console.log students students data, and then we put data here, and then here we can say return data, right? So we've written our method that is going to create a student in a database, but of course remember now we are just testing. We are not we haven't integrated a database, so we are just getting the data that is being posted and logging it and then returning it back. So in this case we get this method which is get student, and so we go to our routes file. So here we shall say teachers controller sorry, why am I it's students controller, then dot, you can see we have our method create student. So you say create student, but remember it takes in a parameter. If you look at it, this is you can see where I'm hovering request, so it takes in the request object, and so this means that whenever we a request for creating a student is received, it is going to be handled by a method called create student, which exists in the controller called the get students controller, so which is here. Yeah, when you hover over it and you click, you press control, you hover over it, you will see it underlined, of course. Here press control on the keyboard, hover over it, you see it underlined, which means that that method exists. When you click it, it takes you exactly where that method is, which is in the students controller. And so you have this data being returned. Yeah, you have this data being returned, and so from there, that means we can post that the post request for creating a student here, it is being handled by create student in the students controller. So if we come here and we create student, we go to create student endpoint, and then we click this, realize that we have the response being returned, and when you go to the console you can see students data. But where is this students data? It is in the method create student, yeah, which is being logged here. So you can see we have the data students data being logged, and we can see that this exists within the create student method in the students controller. So that's basically it on controllers. So yeah, now we've I like how far we've come so far. We destructured our routes from the index file, and we created a unique folder or a dedicated folder for routes, where we created the students file for routes, teachers file for routes, and accountants. Now today we've seen how do we separate the business logic and put it in a dedicated folder, which we've of course seen that we call it controllers. So we've created a dedicated folder controllers, where we have the request being processed by controllers in the controllers folder. And we've said that of course controllers, they process data, they handle incoming requests. For example, if you request talk teachers, if you want to get a list of teachers, it is being handled by get teachers method that exists in a controller called the get what a controller called the teachers controller. We've seen we have also seen that by creating students controller, and when you go to the students routes, you can see that we have a method get students, which is written within students controller, and this get students is the one that is handling returning a list of students. So that's basically how you can separate your business logic what you can call the handling of incoming requests, putting that logic in a specific files we call controllers, and we usually put them in a folder called controllers. So using that architecture that I talked about, or that architecture pattern we've called MVC, where I said you have models that deal with data, you have the views which deal with the user interfaces, and then you have the controllers which process the incoming requests or process data or handle business logic. So I invite any questions for today. I hope you've learned how to use controllers. this next session we shall now integrate with the database. Now we've been posting student details, but we log just the details on the console, or we just return that data. Now in our next session we need to make sure we can create database. We can post that data. If we are saying we are creating a student, we need to post that data, and we see the data being stored in a database. Yeah, if we post a student, we need to see the records being stored in a database. Then if we are retrieving students, we need to retrieve them directly from the database, instead of getting hard-coded data as we are using in this data file, where we have the hard-coded values in this constants file, which is data. Do you have any questions, please? Do you have any questions, please? Sorry? You're saying it's okay?
Yes, sir. For my case,
Okay, okay.
along with the way I can practice things, I will contact you.
Yes, sir. Hello?
Yes, Frank.
Okay. My question is
Yes.
about this module.export.
Yes.
Does module stand for MVC or
No, it does not. It does not. Yeah, MVC is just an architecture. When you say module.exports, it does not mean that you are talking about MVC. No, module.exports helps you to export what you've got inside here, like the entire module. In this case, we have our module as students controller, so we want to access everything that exists within this controller. We want to access students, get students, create students. So to access everything within, we export as an entire module. When you export get students module or students controller module, then you have everything that is within that's why when you go to students routes, you realize that we are able to get students, we are able to access also create student. Why? Because we exported the entire module, which is students controller. So when you say module.export, it does not refer to MVC. You're meaning that you're exporting the entire module, which has all the methods that you have within this controller, for example. Understood?
okay, sir?
Yeah. So I hope we are okay, right? Any question? Derek, Deus, are we okay?
Me, I'm fine, sir.
Okay, good. So that's nice. So we've literally, this is a very, where we are now is a very good step, I would tell you, in API development. So make sure you practice what we've looked at today, basically how to integrate controllers, and then next session we shall integrate database. From database there, the rest of the things we shall learn them when we are implementing the projects. So I believe now we are good to go. I will share the video, of course the link. Please make sure you practice, and let's please meet in the next session.